Well, let us get started this evening. We have an enjoyable evening to look forward to. How many of you were here last week? Good. Most everyone was here. Well, welcome back. This is the third in the series on Persia, entitled From Persepolis to Tehran. And it really is something different for the World Affairs Council because it goes back and looks more at the context rather than just current events. How history and the past influences the present. Last week we had a fascinating program with Dr. Good from Grand Valley, a history professor there, who showed a movie, really fascinating and rather startling in places, a movie on mysticism, which you all heard, or most of you did anyway, and then had the discussion afterwards. Today Dr. Good is back. And he is going to be speaking to us today from his book, Negotiating for the Past. And at the end of this program, there will be a book signing out in front. So anybody who wants to buy the book can do it and get a signed copy of it as well. And he's going to be speaking to that and the influence that archaeology and the both finding and excavating and working with the old, the historic sites builds nationalism in the region. So that should be, tonight's program should be very, very interesting. It's a little bit of Indiana Jones brought here to West Michigan. Also, next week, as I indicated last week in the introduction, that the State Department is not going to have someone here because of transition issues. Again, not quite sure what that means. But instead, it'll be next Thursday, which is the time it was always scheduled to be. But the speakers are going to be Dr. Hasham Sadki from Eastern Michigan, Dr. Saeed Khan from Wayne State, and a third speaker, which I will introduce right now, which is Dr. Maj Al-Mallah, who is the head of Middle Eastern Studies at Grand Valley. Right there, if you'd stand up just for a moment. You all should have received this, which is going to be used by Dr. Good in his presentation this evening. There will be a quiz at the end of the program, so I hope you are all paying rapt attention. And Dr. Al-Mallah is Dr. Good's boss, so he may be here to give quizzes as well and to provide extra commentary. But no, we're looking forward very much to the program next week as well. I'd also like to introduce Martha Fujita tonight. She is our events coordinator here at the World Affairs Council and helping out Dixie, and has been instrumental in putting this series together, and so we appreciate that. And so with those brief introductions, I think we should get to the actual program. Dr. Good?
Thanks very much. I can imagine you're probably thinking, oh, him again, wow. Anyway, hopefully this will be interesting. It'll be interesting for me in any case. What I wanted to do was to begin talking about the book and how the book was conceived and kind of some of the general...
Did I take your notes?
You might have done that, yes. In which case, it will be a very short program. Yes, little trick there. Okay, I wanted to talk a bit about the book and the way the book is organized, and then talk about specifically how it relates to Iran. So let me just say something about the book. I came to this subject actually many years ago. I'm embarrassed to say how many years ago. I was working in the National Archives, and I was working on a very standard foreign policy subject, embassy to embassy sorts of things. And then I kept coming across slips of paper. They cross-reference everything in the files, and it said, see Persepolis, see Persepolis. I was working on Iran, and I thought, what is the see Persepolis? I've seen Persepolis. I mean, I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Iran, and I'd seen Persepolis, but it didn't make any sense to me. It didn't connect. So I made a note that when I had time, I would go back and I would start looking at these files to see what I should see about Persepolis. And I began to read about it and read the files, and they're really fascinating about various crises in diplomatic relations associated with archaeological sites in Iran in the 1920s, and particularly in the 1930s. So I said, well, this would make a good short book, or it would make a good long article. So I began working on it, and then I began to realize that actually the story of U.S.-Iranian relations was actually replicated in many countries in the Middle East in the interwar period. And so I said, well, as I came to know more about Turkey in that period under Ataturk, I said, well, it's the same story here. And then I began to look at Iraq, and I discovered that basically it was the same. And then finally I looked at Egypt and found that, lo and behold, basically the story of Iran is repeated in each of these four countries. And so I kept expanding the work, and of course it required working in more archives, and it took more time and so forth. So eventually last year the book was published, but that's how I came to it. And these four countries in particular, I chose them because these are countries in which the nationalists came to power in each of those four countries in the 1930s. And so they really did manage to have an important stake in what happened to their antiquities and their archaeological sites prior to World War II. I mean, traditionally, the view is that many of these countries in the Middle East, they were kind of abject and they were kind of manipulated by the West and so forth. But in actual fact, what I found, at least in the case of archaeology, and that was for specific reasons, they actually managed to exercise a lot more influence, control, and authority in that realm anyway, in those four countries. And so that's the background to the book. And I wanted to just say a few words about each of these items that are in the title: archaeology, nationalism, and diplomacy, and then look specifically at how this played out in Iran. I sort of divide archaeology, very broadly into three periods: the pre-World War I, the interwar period, and then post-World War II. And the pre-World War I period was basically a time when there were very few rules and regulations on Western archaeologists doing work in the Middle East. And by the way, just one other footnote here is, I happen to be focusing on the Middle East because that's what I do. But this story was unfolding in similar ways in Latin America and in East Asia and in Central Asia at the same time. But, I wasn't going to go there. But this could be done in those areas as well, during the same time. Anyway, the pre-World War I was a period when there were very few rules and regulations, and so Western archaeologists were excavating, and basically they were bringing whatever they excavated, tore out of the earth, and bringing them back to their home countries. And it was this period when the late 19th century, sometimes the early 19th century, and into the early 20th century, when the Louvre, if you visited the Louvre, the British Museum, the museum in Berlin, and even the Metropolitan, to some extent in the United States, were filled with these treasures from the Middle East. And then came the interwar period, and this is really a period of transformation and transition, and this is the period that I'm most interested in. Because a couple of things happened here. First of all, you get the rise of nationalists who begin to try to put the brakes on what Western archaeologists were doing. But archaeology itself is becoming much more scientific in the interwar period. And by that I mean they're using photography much more. So if you go into any of the archives from that period to do with archaeological sites, you'll see hundreds and hundreds of photographs of pots, from every different direction and up and under, and pictures of fragments and so forth. This is something pretty new in the field. So they're doing this, and they're also recording the location of finds. Where exactly was something found within a dig, and they're recording every layer, what was found in every layer in these sites. So this is really something that's new. It's becoming much more scientific, and I just wanted to read you a short excerpt describing this period. As scientific knowledge had grown, archaeologists came to realize that an object had importance principally in relation to the location where it was found. A pot, in isolation, revealed little about the culture from which it came. Ripped from the earth, most of its historical record was irretrievably lost. Even in the 1930s, these progressive ideas were becoming more commonly accepted. And so prior to World War I, the tendency was just to dig into mounds, recover materials and so forth. There wasn't much of a record. I mean, this isn't absolute, but they tended not to be a very careful scientific record kept until this interwar period. Also, for the first time, many archaeologists and foreign museums had been in the habit of purchasing antiquities, and they didn't know really what the origin of these antiquities were, and they didn't really ask many questions. The provenance, which you hear a lot about today, but they didn't know what the provenance of these were. And in the 1920s and the 1930s, this is beginning to be frowned upon. You begin to sort out the archaeologists into those who will buy antiquities from dealers, and to those who will not buy them unless they know where they came from and they are certain that they were brought legally out of the country to the West. And this is an element that appears again and again in the book, discussion of this. And so nationalists, particularly as they take control in these countries, are trying to exert their influence over Western archaeologists who are very, very busily excavating in the region. And the problem particularly is particularly acute with Western archaeologists who were excavating in the region prior to World War I, because they were kind of excavating, in the Wild West of archaeology, if you like. And then they came back after the war and they began to excavate. And they thought that the same rules were going to apply, that is, relatively no rules. And what they began to run up against was, gradually tightening restrictions with the rise of nationalism. As nationalism rises, they face more and more restrictions. And this leads to a lot of crises and conflicts and so forth. And it just so happens that this is a period when some of the greatest archaeological finds ever in the history of Middle Eastern archaeology are discovered. And so these serve like lightning rods because they bring all of these contending parties together. For instance, in Egypt, of course, it's the tomb of Tutankhamun in the Valley of the Kings. And in Iraq, it's which Leonard Woolley excavates in southern, the Sumerian city in southern Iraq. And in Iran, it's Persepolis. The Iranians have always known that Persepolis was there, but it was pretty much buried. And I should say, as a footnote, I hope you'll take a moment at the end to look at some of the photographs, because you'll see the state of Persepolis in the 1920s. It was filled in with, more than 2,000 years of dust blown in and so forth. And so all of these treasures lay hidden from the eye in the early 1920s. Now, the Americans were particularly, of the Western archaeologists, or I should say of the Western archaeological institutions, the Americans were in the forefront. Why? Because they had money. They had lots of money, and the Europeans didn't have any money, or had very little money after fighting World War I. So the Americans had the money, but they didn't have the archaeologists, because archaeology, there were very few students being trained in archaeology in the United States. So they took American money and they hired European archaeologists, British, French, German, Dutch, and so forth. And so the book, my book, is full of these archaeologists who are in the employ of American institutions. For instance, probably the premier American institution in the interwar period was the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago, which was founded by a very charismatic individual by the name of James Breasted, who was actually an Egyptologist. But he wanted to make the University of Chicago and the Oriental Institute kind of what we would call today kind of the think tank of archaeology for the United States. And he was well on the way to doing that. And had he not, died, in the middle of his task, he might well have achieved that. So that was a very, and I don't know if any of you have ever been to the museum, the Oriental Institute Museum in Chicago, but if you haven't, it's a real delight, and you should visit it, and you can see all of the pieces that were recovered from these excavations in the Middle East in the 1920s and the first half in the 1930s. And I actually there's one very important piece, an ancient Mesopotamian piece, and I actually was able to trace how Breasted came into the possession of that piece and how it made its way back to the United States and ended up behind glass at the Oriental Institute. And you won't see on the little tablet at the Oriental Institute this story, so, but it's in the book anyway. And besides the Oriental Institute, there was the University of Pennsylvania, was one of the leaders, and the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. And actually the University of Michigan was pretty active too in this period. But most of the archaeologists were European. And then, of course, the third period, I said pre-World War I, the period of transformation, and then the final one is post-World War II. And, of course, all the Europeans leave when the war comes, and that's really great for the nationalists and for the locals, because then they kind of extend their influence over the archaeological sites. And so what you get after World War II is a different scene again, and that's a period really when you have either, in some countries, you have only local nationals doing the archaeological work, because by that time their own people are being trained as archaeologists, or you get them working in combination as experts with Western archaeologists, something that never happened in the pre-war period, which is really rather interesting, that Western archaeologists, although they sensed that control in the field was shifting to the hands of Iranians, Iraqis, Turks, Egyptians, and so forth, they never really did anything to help train a generation of young locals to be archaeologists and so forth, which I always found rather peculiar, because they're very aware and frightened of the locals taking control of archaeology, but they never really did anything to kind of direct how that might play out. So anyway, this is archaeology, and I'm being much too long-winded here, so I better move on a little more quickly. Nationalism, what I'm talking about, there are many kinds of nationalism, and the nationalism I talk about is really what is referred to by many historians as elite nationalism, or nationalism from the top down, or in the case of Iran, it's referred to as dynastic nationalism. So it's an elite really trying to grow this idea that there's this thousands of year record of a connection to the ancient past, and trying to instill this idea into the citizens of these nations. Sometimes these nations are new nations, sometimes they're very ancient nations. But to to kind of convince their citizens that that greatness, which they once experienced thousands of years before, they can achieve again. And so they're making this very strong connection between the ancient past. Usually, it is the ancient past and the present. And usually, a footnote here is that in order to make their case, they usually, many of the leaders of these nationalist movements tend to disparage the influence of the Arabs and of Islam on their societies. Often they hold Islam and the Arabs responsible for the loss of that ancient greatness. So they kind of skip over the Islamic centuries and go back to the ancient dynasties, the pre-Islamic dynasties and so forth. So as you can imagine, this becomes a rather touchy subject at the end of this period, and so forth. Anyway, so this is the nationalism. How are they going to spread this? They're going to spread this message of nationalism, inculcating this new, really, myths of nationhood. They're going to inculcate these into the population through education. So they revise the curricula in these countries because they think this is the best way to get this message across, to inculcate it into the minds of the young people in these countries. Particularly in elementary school and so forth. And so you get lots of stories, glorious stories of ancient heroes of the past, some of them real, some of them fictitious, but all, going towards the same purpose. They do it in the military. They do it with inductees in the military. They present, culture lessons and so forth, trying to get them to be proud of their ancient past and proud soldiers of their modern armies and so forth. They do it through the media. Papers in the region are just full of... Some papers are exclusively devoted to the message of this new national identity and glorification of the ancient past. They seem to have no other purpose than that. And so they're trying to get this message across. They're trying to control the Western archaeologists, but they're also using the discoveries of the Western archaeologists to further their own agendas. So while they are sometimes critical of what the Western archaeologists are doing, when the Western archaeologists make these wonderful discoveries and these great antiquities and so forth, they're saying, see, these are the great things that our ancestors did, and we should be proud of who we are, and we can be that way again, and so forth. So it's kind of a very interesting relationship that develops in this period. And the final piece is diplomacy. And, we're so used to a government which is so huge and has so many contacts all over the world that it's hard to see how, one or two archaeologists working in central Iran could be very important. But in the 1920s and in the 1930s, virtually the only successful contact that the United States had with Iran, for instance, is its archaeological program. And so the diplomats were very interested in doing whatever they could to further the interests of American archaeologists in the Middle East, and again, worldwide, but I'm specifically focusing on the Middle East. And so they would help them at whatever point they could. The archaeologists, in turn, were very well-educated men, and they were almost all men. There were a few women late in the period, but mainly they were men. And they came from an elite in the United States, and they had very good contacts in Washington. And as I started to say, the American government was very small, and these archaeologists knew policymakers very well. Teddy Roosevelt, Dwight Morrow, if that name means anything to you, Anne Morrow's father, who Anne Morrow married Charles Lindbergh in the 1920s. Elihu Root, who was Secretary of War and Secretary of War, and Frank Kellogg, Charles Evans Hughes, all of these people. And when the archaeologists would come back from the field, they would always stop in Washington, and they would have meetings with these top policymakers and so forth in the State Department and so on. And so they maintained these contacts. And the diplomat the title of the book, not the subtitle, but the main title is Negotiating for the Past. And the negotiation here is negotiating between nationalists and Western archaeologists as to the meaning of the archaeological record. What did it mean? How are we to interpret this? And actually, one instance I can show you how they had very different views. The nationalists in the Middle East tended to look at these archaeological discoveries, and they said, how wonderful. See what our ancestors did. We should be full of pride and so forth. So that was the way, this boosted them and their agenda to strengthen ideas of citizenship and so forth. The Western archaeologists looked at these astounding discoveries and they said, boy, how far these people have fallen. They are decrepit. I mean, they once had this wonderful society, and look where they are now. So they had very different takes on what it all meant. And I could spend a lot of time talking about that, but I'll move on because I want to get to Iran pretty quickly. So that was one case, negotiating for the past. What does the record mean? And then, of course, the more obvious meaning is who's going to control the antiquities. Who's going to control the sites? Where are they going to excavate? Just by the very fact of where you excavate, you determine what you're going to find. And if you have a particular agenda, you will dig in some places. And if you don't have that agenda, you have another agenda, you'll dig somewhere else. So this was a contested area for the archaeologists and the nationalists, and incidentally, the diplomats in this period. And my contention is that by the beginning of World War II, in each of these four countries anyway, the nationalists had made tremendous headway in controlling really their own archaeological futures. And I could talk about that later on in some detail about that. And this, I think, is kind of a new determination for U.S. or for Western and Middle Eastern relationships. Now, I will take a short drink of water. It should progress. Now I want to switch to the focus of this series, which is Iran. So how does all of that, archaeology, national diplomacy, how does that play out in the case of Iran specifically? And I could do this for Turkey or for Egypt, Iraq, and basically, quite seriously, you could almost switch those four names of those four countries and tell the same story, and it would be very, very similar, frighteningly similar, actually. So Iran, the French have been excavating in Iran for quite some time. They begin in the late 19th century. And in the year 1900, they managed to get the then Shah of Iran, who is one of the last of a dynasty. If you have your piece of paper there, this is the Qajar dynasty, which rules from 1794 to 1925, and they are in their dotage around 1900, looking for money, because the Shahs, towards the end of the Qajar line, they like to take extravagant trips to Europe with huge retinues, and that costs a lot of money. And so they needed to get cash for that, and so they tended to just kind of sell off the assets of the country. And one of the assets that I think it was Mozaffar ad-Din Shah sold off was the right to excavate the monopoly to excavate all over Iran. And he sold that for really a pittance to France. So from 1900 to 1930, the French had a monopoly over all archaeological excavation in Iran. But the French didn't really have the money to excavate everywhere. So actually they only excavated, or largely they excavated in one site, which is, I use my little tool here, Susa. Susa was the winter capital of one of the ancient Iranian dynasties, the Achaemenid dynasty, and then also the Sasanian dynasty, which was a successor dynasty, used that as well. So the French really worked in this region here, which is down, it's most of Iran. This area here is a high plateau, but this area is down pretty much at sea level, not far from the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, which are here. So the French concentrated their efforts at Susa, and they had, wonderful discoveries and so forth. And I can just read you a little bit about this. I don't know how many of you have been to the Louvre, but if you ever go to the Louvre, make sure that you go to the room, the Achaemenid room and so forth, because it's just astounding. Anyway, I'll just read you this section about the French. On the hot, humid plains around Susa, the digging season was short. Archaeologists usually arrived in mid-January and stopped their work by early April. After shipping artifacts to the Louvre by barge down the Karun River system to its juncture with the Shatt al-Arab, and from there by ship, the archaeologists soon followed, arriving home in time to enjoy the mild temperatures of late spring in France. Although they enjoyed a monopoly in all of Iran, the French concentrated their efforts at Susa, and they were richly rewarded. The Iranian rooms in the Louvre were filled with the wondrous treasures from those years. More impressive than the objects of gold and silver were the colorful walls of enameled brick showing the archers and foot soldiers of Darius I. The French did well from their decades-long excavation. So this is a little bit about the French excavating at Susa. Now, while they're excavating, and particularly even before World War I, but after World War I as well, nationalism is on the rise. There's a revolution in Iran. It begins in 1906 and lasts from 1906 to 1911. And this, a lot of nationalism activities are associated with this and so forth. And an elite group get together and form what is called the Society for the Preservation of the National Heritage. And its membership is a who's who of Iranian leaders in the pre-World War I and post-World War I period. There is Muhammad Ali Furughi, who is a prime minister and holds many important positions in the government. Hussein Allah, Abdul Hussein Temurtash, Mohammad Mossadegh, many people are involved in this. And many of these members of this society write books incorporating the discoveries of Western archaeologists and writing this grand history of ancient Iran. So that is one very important development that takes Iran in this area. And again, let me just read you quickly about this group and the intent of their organization. The glories of the ancients, especially the Achaemenid and Sasanian dynasties, which arose out of the peoples on the Iranian plateau, could serve as inspiration for a people too long subjected to the uninspired rule of the corrupt Qajars. As one newspaper reported, recent discoveries near Tehran might lead to the information that, quote, 50,000 years ago Persia existed and was ruled by an independent government, end quote. Resurrecting and reconstructing this history of the nation was too important a task to be left in the hands of foreigners who seemed interested only in filling museums in their far-off Western capitals. So this is the task of this new society. And at the same time, you get the establishment of a new dynasty, the Pahlavi dynasty, which the name alone is suggested because Pahlavi is the ancient language of Iran. And so they took the name of that ancient language of Iran and made that the name of this dynasty. And this is the last dynasty that ruled in Iran from 1925 to the revolution in 1979. And Reza Shah, Mohammad Reza Shah, is the first of the Shahs in this dynasty. And I'll just read you another little clip. It says, after his successful coup in 1921, Reza Khan, or Reza Shah he will become, had sent the following message to reassure the military. Quote, "Gentlemen, our dear homeland stands in urgent need of its brave sons. Be alert and diligent. The dust of Ardashir is watching over you," end quote. Now, Ardashir was the founder of the Sasanian dynasty, a purely Persian dynasty, if you like, in the terms of the 1930s, an Aryan dynasty, and he's recollecting these images for the officers in the new army which he is creating. And then I go on to say, throughout his political career, the founder of the Pahlavi dynasty encouraged patriotism and national progress by conjuring images of ancient glory in his speeches to the troops. So this is a very important development. So these groups are beginning to bring pressure on the French. They're tired of this. The Qajars gave away too much for a pittance. They want the monopoly to end. And interesting enough, the Americans are supporting this push because the Americans, we hear a lot about the open door, right, in American history. And we think of oil and we think of trade. But the Americans are looking for the open door everywhere. And the French have closed the door in Iran. And so that means that American archaeologists and institutions cannot excavate legally within the Iranian realm. And so the Americans are pushing all the time, and with great glee when the French take a hit. And gradually the French control over archaeology is weakening and so forth. And finally, by the end of the 1930s, the French give way. They recognize that they must give way. And the consolation is that they get to appoint or suggest a French archaeologist to be the director of antiquities in Iran for the immediate future. And they actually pick a man whose name I have on the list. I think he's on the list, André Godard. And Godard actually stays in that office from, I think, 1932 until 1952. So for 20 years, no one expected him to stay in that office for so long. But my argument would be that even though he's director of antiquities, in practice, he actually has very little authority, little to no authority. Authority is actually held by Iranian officials, his superior in the Department of Education and then in the Department of Culture and so forth later on. Anyway, so here's the opportunity, and the kind of the plum of Iranian archaeology at this time is Persepolis, or as the Iranians call it, Takht-i-Jamshid. Takht-i-Jamshid means the palace or the throne of Jamshid, and Jamshid is kind of a mythical Iranian king, and the Iranians knew about this site. But they didn't really know where it came from. Some, innocents would say it was made by this race of superhuman men long ago who came to Earth or whatever, and no one knew for sure. But they knew it had a lot of importance to their history and so forth. And it hadn't been excavated. Now, Susa had been a capital, and it had been quite heavily excavated by the French for many years. But Persepolis was kind of pristine in many ways. And so this became the focus of the American archaeologists, and particularly the University of Chicago. And James Breasted, with lots of money from John D. Rockefeller Jr. John D. Rockefeller Jr. and Breasted were very simpatico, and over the years, Rockefeller may have given as much as $20 million to Breasted and to his enterprises in different parts of the Middle East. So this was really a wonderful a wonderful development for Breasted. Now, Breasted, the opportunity to excavate Persepolis came in 1931. It was sooner than Breasted. By that time, the Great Depression had started, and Breasted, even with Rockefeller money, he was a bit pressed to keep, because he had excavations going all over the Middle East. And so it really didn't fit in his schedule to take up this opportunity. But the diplomats weighed in, and they pressed him, and they said, you must do this. What will it look like if the premier, archaeological institution in the United States seeks this concession and then doesn't accept it from the Iranian government? And so under pressure, Breasted, undertakes this excavation, and he selects to direct this a man by the name of Ernst Herzfeld, who has a long and in some ways distinguished career in Middle Eastern archaeology. He is a German Jew who teaches at the University of Berlin, who is on leave, extended leave from the University of Berlin. And there are some interesting passages in the book that I won't go into about the negotiations that Breasted has to go through with the newly arrived Nazis in Berlin in order to get them to extend Herzfeld's leave of absence so that he can stay in Iran and work in 1933 and 1934. Anyway, Herzfeld becomes the director, and the Shah and other high officials of the Iranian government are frequently visiting this gem that means so much to the Iranians. And I have a little quote about this movement. It says, what one scholar has labeled dynastic nationalism was in full bloom by the end of the 1920s. The movement had built on works going back to the 19th century. The move to impress upon the Iranian public, especially the growing numbers of students and soldiers, respect for the nation's ancient history and monuments, had the full support of the state. This program would strengthen Iranians' resolve to lead their country by means of progressive reform into the circle of great nations once again. So this movement is taking place. Lots of top brass visiting, and you can see the capital. It's not an easy journey. I mean, the capital Tehran is here. Persepolis is down here. This would have been probably a 2-day or longer road trip. There were a few planes, but they tended to come by road actually, rather than fly in most of the time. So this showed, I think, a lot of interest, a lot of commitment on the part of the leaders of the new dynasty and the governments of the dynasty and so forth. And then there were lots of interesting discoveries made at the time, and some of these found their way into the Shah's palace in Tehran, particularly the foundation tablets. Each corner of the palace at Persepolis had gold and silver foundation tablets that had been put there when the palace was built in around 500 or so BC, and these were excavated. A couple of them were sent to the palace in Tehran, and the Shah, that's Reza Shah, would pull them out to show guests and to show officers and so forth, and make speeches about the ancient glories of Iran and so forth. And of course, they're also very interested in the impact it would have on education. And again, I'll read a little quote here. It's, editors took pains to emphasize the importance of these monuments for Iranian youth, and the Minister of Public Instruction, that was the Minister of Education, the Minister of Public Instruction agreed, sending collections of photographs of the most important monuments to the nation's schools to be used in the study of Iran's ancient history. The objective was to create in the minds of students, quote, a living consciousness of the past by showing the great achievements of the race, end quote. Pilgrimages there not only taught the lessons of the past, but also instilled an ardor for the future. So it was all connected. And then, of course, the media, and this is one of my favorites. As I said, the media, the newspapers were full of stories about ancient glories and pictures and so forth. And the poets got into the act, and poetry is very, very important in Iran. And so I have this little excerpt. Recent archaeological discoveries prove that Iran was the cradle of civilization, whose glories were being restored under Reza Shah. One poet lavished praise on him, citing his restoration of the ancient splendor of Takht Jamshid, and concluding, quote, this is talking about Darius. Darius was one of the great Achaemenid rulers. I don't have him on the list. But the shade of the great Darius returns to his cold stone, and on his couch of granite, happy, satisfied, says to himself, sleep in peace, O my soul, you live again through the rebirth of Persepolis and Pasargada and these other ancient sites and so forth. So it's quite a movement going on to glorify the past and connect it to the future. Now, no sooner had the Americans got in place at Persepolis than they began to run into problems. Because after all, this is a national treasure. So, the eyes of officialdom are, on the Americans all the time, making sure that they do what they're going to say they do, that they don't destroy anything, that they don't steal anything, and so forth. And there's a lot of mistrust of Hertzfeld, because Hertzfeld has a long history of activity in the Middle East. And he has been a collector from time to time when it was okay to be a collector. And it's not really clear whether he continued to collect when he was the director at Persepolis. He certainly had a huge personal collection of antiquities from throughout his career. So there was a certain amount of mistrust, and Hertzfeld could be very, very rude to officials, and he got himself, he created a lot of problems for himself. They were having this huge celebration of one of the greatest, if not the greatest of all Persian poets, a man by the name of Ferdowsi. And they were celebrating the 1000th anniversary of his birthday in 1933 or 1934. And the new dynasty was making a big thing about this. They had rediscovered, they said, the tomb of Ferdowsi in the eastern part of the country, over here, Tus. He's buried at Tus. And they had rediscovered it, and they had built this marvelous tomb, like an ancient Achaemenid tomb and so forth. And, and they wanted Hertzfeld to play an important part in this role. And they invited him, and they were going to bring a delegation of foreign archaeologists down to Persepolis and so forth. And Hertzfeld never answered their invitation. He just, ignored it and went on with his work at excavating. And so they got so upset that they canceled the side trip for these foreign archaeologists to Persepolis, and he began to have a lot of problems. And there are other problems too, because when the Iranians created a new antiquities law, in that law they said that anything that was discovered at Persepolis, the law would not apply to, because for the rest of the country, if you discovered any antiquities, there was a special mechanism for how these would be divided between the excavators and the state, or the landowner. But for Persepolis, because it was such a special place, they said the Council of Ministers in Tehran would have to determine what, if any, of these antiquities from Persepolis or within a mile around the precinct would be given and allowed to go abroad. And so when it came for the first year division, the University of Chicago and Breasted and Hertzfeld was expecting all these wonderful things to come to their lot. And the Iranians said, no, wait a minute, this is not on. We have this law and so forth. So they really got into this debate in the early 1930s. And this is Breasted. I mean, Breasted was not shy about making his position known. He was rather insensitive. I mean, that's the best you could say about him, I think, on this particular issue. And so here he is, writing to his son at the end of July 1934. Breasted concluded, quote, It is a big contract to undertake the education of the Persian government, but I have no doubt we can improve matters if we stick to the job, and at least show them that they can't bluff us. I am enormously thankful for Wallace Murray, end quote. Now, Wallace Murray was then the Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs, and he was sort of championing the University of Chicago in its dispute with the Iranian government. Perhaps not a very wise position to get himself into, but nevertheless, this was important for the policymakers. Eventually, and if you want the details, you can read the book. Eventually, they are able to work out a compromise between Chicago and the Iranian government. The American ambassador in Iran actually mediates, and he works out a compromise. But basically, the Iranians are able to hang on to their principle that Persepolis is a special case, and every time at the end of a digging year, the University of Chicago wants to divide up the antiquities they found. They have to go back to the government in Tehran and get special permission. And so it's not a given that it's going to be 50-50 division as it is in much of the rest of the country. And so Breasted takes a sigh of relief. He's going to get all of these. He's going to get some antiquities. He's going to get a lot of clay tablets, the old clay tablets that they used to use and so forth. And he's quite happy. And then the other shoe drops. The Iranians tell Breasted they want Herzfeld out of the country. He's actually out of the country at the time. They don't want him to return. And Breasted and the American diplomats do everything they can to get Herzfeld back into the country. They say he's the leading scholar of Iranian history. How can you have the excavation go on without him? Can he just come back in an advisory role if he's not director? They say no, no, no. And so he's forced. So this is kind of a second exile for Herzfeld. He's been exiled from Germany, and now he's exiled from Iran. And he ends up very unhappily at Princeton University because he really doesn't like the United States, and he makes it very clear he doesn't like the United States. They just don't show him he feels that he's one of the most important archaeologists of his day, and they just don't show him the respect that he deserves. And so he stays here through the 1930s, and then as soon as the war is over, he leaves. As soon as he can leave safely, he leaves, and he goes back to the Middle East and dies in the Middle East in the late 1940s. So then they bring in a man called Erich Schmidt, who is on your list, another German, and a World War I veteran, and he starts to work at Persepolis, but he also encounters problems because Schmidt, by this time, has gotten very interested in aerial photography. He thinks this is the wave of the future. Rather than just, digging into these mounds and so forth, he says if we fly over and we take these pictures from the air, we can see so much from the air, and then we'll know exactly where we want to excavate. So he brings in a plane called, he calls it the Friend of Iran. And you can imagine, security-wise, this is a really big issue because the war is approaching, and the government in Tehran is not happy, and the military in Tehran is not happy about this American plane flying all over in border areas and taking pictures of who knows what and so forth. He has to take an Iranian representative with him when he flies. But nevertheless, they ground him, and then they let him fly, and then they ground him. He's driven almost to distraction. And you could have almost predicted this because, this was a really touchy issue. Schmidt didn't seem to really understand just how difficult this situation would be. I should say the end product of all of these flights is a wonderful book called Flights Over Ancient Cities of Iran. And it's really worth trying to seek out a copy of that book and look at the photographs because they're just really astounding photographs, black and white photographs from those years. But he made a tremendous effort trying to get those photographs and so forth. And partly his problem is the plane. Partly his problem is that U.S.-Iranian relations are in a tailspin in the 1930s. And again, I won't go into the details why, but relations are not very good. And so this is one way for the regime in Tehran to show its displeasure with the United States government by impacting on American archaeologists working there. So they slow things up, they make things more difficult when relations are bad, and so this is what Schmidt says why he's having so many problems. And then the Americans have the disaster that James Breasted, who's kind of Breasted has been able to keep this excavation at Persepolis going with Rockefeller money. Rockefeller constantly wants to pull his money out, and Breasted constantly, encourages him to keep his money in, and he does. And then Breasted dies at the end of 1935. And so after that, it's just a matter of months before the Rockefeller Foundation pulls their money out of the excavation. And so then Schmidt has to go to other institutions, American institutions, to get them to contribute the money that has been withdrawn. And he gets the University of Pennsylvania and the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. So then it's a consortium of Chicago, Pennsylvania, and the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. And it runs that way from about 1936 to 1939. And finally, the Americans close up shop in the fall of 1939. World War II has begun, and they're leaving. And Schmidt is very happy to leave. He had already given, when he arrived, he had given the plane to the Iranian government. Then in 1939, he tries to get permission to take it out of the country because he wants to go to Iraq and photograph there. And they say no. And then he gives it to Iran again. And he leaves the plane behind. And he goes off, he goes back to the United States. He's become an American citizen by this time. And this is the point at which the Iranians take control of the site, which is what they've been angling for all the time. And I said once the American expedition had departed, the Department of Antiquities took control at Persepolis, and Godard put 200 men to work under an Iranian director to continue the excavation. Article 3 of the 1922 Constitution of the Society for the Preservation of the National Heritage had hinted that only Iranians could fully appreciate and protect their cultural heritage. Now that the nation's premier archaeological site was at last in trusted hands, they could breathe more easily. And so that's how the interwar period ends. I just want to say a couple of words about what happens. Reza Shah, who starts the dynasty, is expelled from Iran, forced to go into exile, to abdicate and to go into exile in 1941 by the British and the Russians. And he goes into exile and he dies in exile. His son, Mohammad Reza Shah, comes to the throne. And he continues very much with this dynastic nationalism. If anything, it's even expanded because he has a greater facility and more wealth to expand this sense of the importance of the ancient world. He even brings in Nasrin Rahimieh. When she was here, she referred to the 5,000-year or the 2,500-year calendar that the Shah introduced. Rather than using the Islamic calendar, he brought in this 2,500 years because the monarchists believe that monarchy in Iran could be traced back 2,500 years, back before the time of the Achaemenids or whatever. And so he brings in this new calendar. And then in 1971, October of 1971, the Shah organizes this huge bash, lauding the successes of his dynasty and making, in case anyone missed it, the connections between the ancients and the moderns. And he spends a fortune. And this may be the straw that broke the camel's back, actually, because right after he imports food from Maxime's in Paris, and all the waiters are imported, and all the crowned heads of Europe and elsewhere invited, not common Iranians. They kept at a distance and so forth. But part of the ceremony is to go to Pasargadae, where the tomb of Cyrus is. Cyrus is the founder of the Achaemenid dynasty, and to talk to Cyrus. So the Shah goes, and red carpet and masked elites and crowned heads and so forth, and soldiers. And the Shah says this. He says, quote, "Cyrus, great king, king of kings, Achaemenian king, king of the land of Iran, from me, king of kings of Iran, and from my nation, I send greetings. Cyrus, we have gathered here today at your eternal tomb to tell you, sleep in peace, because we are awake, and we will always be awake to look after our proud inheritance." And of course, we know what happens in short time after the 2500th anniversary comes revolutionary activity, and finally the revolution succeeds in 1979. And clearly, the revolutionary authorities are not enamored at all about this glorification of the pre-Islamic dynasties and the pre-Islamic period in Iranian history, particularly because it's so closely connected to the Pahlavi dynasty, who have just been overthrown. So they close a lot of the pre-Islamic sites. They close the Faculty of Archaeology at the University of Tehran for a few years. And they, in turn, begin to glorify the Islamic dynasties. And they begin to rewrite the curriculum and rewrite the books in the schools, building up Islamic heroes rather than the ancient heroes, and they rewrite textbooks and so forth. And they found their own organization called the Iranian Cultural Heritage Organization, which is in charge of all this. So from 79 to 91, the pre-Islamic sites and so forth are kind of in limbo, and the people who spent a lot of time and their careers working on these sites. And then in 1991, the then president of Iran, Ali Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani, who's president, I think, from 1989 to 1997, right? And he visits Persepolis. So this is a breakthrough, and he signs the guest book at Persepolis. And what he says in that is basically, we own all of these dynasties. We own all of our history. This is all part of us. And, we're not going to differentiate between the pre-Islamic and the Islamic, okay? And that has basically been the policy of the Iranian government since 1991. When my wife and I were there in 2003, the government was spending quite substantial sums on 2 major pre-Islamic sites and 2 Islamic sites. So they're balancing their expenditures and so forth in that period. So they've been able then to embrace all of this period and so forth. And this is something I might point out, that the Iraqis next door, that's a big question mark. It's not clear how the Iraqis will end up identifying themselves. Are they Muslims? Are they Arabs? Are they, inheritors of ancient Sumeria, Mesopotamia, and so forth? The jury is still out on that. But of these 4 countries I looked at, the Turks, the Egyptians, and the Iranians, they all have managed to settle this issue, and basically by embracing the totality of their history and not one particular part of it. So there you are. Sorry, it's a little long, but there it is. Thank you.
Would you take a few questions?
Yes, I'll take a few questions. And just let me remind you, maybe after I've been talking, these photos over here might mean a little bit more to you. But anyway, so I encourage you, if you have time, to have a look at them. Questions?
Mm-hmm. So is it just the Iranian archaeologists now working in the country?
Well, there are some foreign archaeologists working there. European, mainly. I have to be honest that, when I finished the book, I haven't really pursued this topic into the the post-war period. But I know that there are some foreign expeditions working there and so forth, and so it's not closed off. And in Iran, actually, longer than most countries in the region allowed for division of antiquities at the end of each season. For instance, Egypt and Turkey and Iraq stopped doing that in the 1930s. Iran didn't stop that, I think, until the 1960s. So you could still get, substantial antiquities from your efforts, quite late into the period when other countries in the region had stopped that. And that, of course, attracted a lot of Western archaeologists to work there, too. But,
So the Persepolis goes back to the time of Darius?
Yeah, it goes back to Darius. It goes back to the Achaemenid dynasty. It was really there. It was one of their capitals. Susa was their summer capital. Another one was Ctesiphon, which is actually near Baghdad. But Persepolis was really a ceremonial capital. The Shah, the ruler of the Achaemenid dynasty, Nowruz, New Year's, their New Year's was the vernal equinox in March. And so every March 21st or whatever, the Shah would go with his retinue to Persepolis. And so it was a very formal, representatives from all the empire would come bearing gifts and so forth, and the elite of the empire would come and so on. But it wasn't a center, where he lived all the time. But there were palaces, there was a treasury there, and so forth. And Alexander the Great, when he defeats the Achaemenids, and then he takes control of Persepolis, and then supposedly, we don't know this for certain, he gives orders, when he's moving to the east, to India and so forth, he gives orders to his soldiers to burn the city. But, that's not for certain that actually happened that way. But anyway. But it's quite amazing. The two photographs I have of Persepolis here is before any excavation began. And unfortunately, I don't have a picture of what it looks like now. But now it stands about 20 feet above the level of the plain. And there are these huge ornamental staircases that go up the side, and they're all engraved in marble with pictures of the representatives of the various subject provinces bringing gifts to the Shah. And that was all buried when Herzfeld began excavating and in the early 1930s. And all you can see is the columns sticking up out of the dust. And so now it looks quite different today. It really does. Any other questions? No? Okay.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hood. I just want to remind you that the final program in the series will be next Thursday, right here at 7 p.m. We will have a panel featuring Dr. Hisham Saki of Eastern Michigan University, Dr. Saeed Khan of Wayne State, and we will be having a moderator from Grand Valley State University, and we just have to confirm that with him. He's going to check his calendar for us. There'll be a book signing as soon as we disperse, so please stop and buy a book and get it signed. Thank you all for coming tonight.